"You stole from my house on Christmas Eve," Charles Hargrove said, and the room went so quiet Ava Brooks could hear the grandfather clock in the front hall dragging each second across the marble like a slow blade. The Christmas party did not stop all at once. It faded in pieces. First the laughter near the piano, then the soft clink of champagne glasses, then the low holiday music coming through the hidden speakers, still cheerful, still wrong. Ava stood near the base of the staircase with a silver tray balanced against her hip, the scent of pine needles and furniture polish mixing with the sharp, clean sting of bleach still clinging to her cuffs. She was 22 years old, wearing a plain black dress, sensible flats, and the kind of careful expression people wore when they had learned that one wrong look could cost them a paycheck. Across from her, under the glow of a 12-foot tree wrapped in white lights and gold ribbon, Charles Hargrove looked like the sort of man magazines called Self-Made and everybody else called Sir. His tuxedo fit like armor. His jaw was tight enough to crack a tooth. In one hand, he held an empty velvet jewelry box. In the other, a cut crystal glass he had stopped drinking from the second he decided who was guilty. "I didn't take anything, sir," Ava said, and her own voice sounded smaller than she meant it to. Too soft for the size of that room. Too human for the way he was staring at her. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, but not one of them spoke. That was how houses like this worked. The richest person's version of the truth arrived first, and everyone else learned to nod before it finished crossing the room. Snow pressed against the tall windows in a thin white drift. Outside, the lawns rolled dark and perfect for acres. Inside, the air was warm enough to make her cheeks burn. Ava could feel eyes on her from every direction. Women in silk gowns, men with silver at their temples, servers frozen in place holding trays they suddenly did not know where to set down. And above all of them, from halfway up the staircase, a boy in a navy blazer watched with his fingers curled around the banister. Noah Hargrove, 10 years old, too still for a child. Ava had seen him like that before, silent as a shadow, his face pale in the soft lamplight, like he had been listening for a voice that no longer lived in the house. She had once found him in the breakfast room turning a spoon in circles through cold oatmeal, and she had said nothing, just warmed it again and left cinnamon on the side, because he liked to add it himself. He had looked at her then, really looked at her, as if kindness had startled him. Now he stood above the party and stared down at his father like he already knew what was coming. "The earrings were in this box less than an hour ago," Charles said. "This room has been full of my family, my guests, and my staff. And you were the last one near the coat room." Ava swallowed. She remembered carrying in a stack of pressed table linens. Remembered Stephen Hale brushing past her too fast, cologne sharp as metal. Remembered the velvet box sitting open on the entry table for no reason she understood. But memory felt useless when power had already made up its mind. "I was doing my job," she said. "That's all." Charles gave a humorless laugh, the kind that landed cold. "That's all." He took one step closer. Not enough to touch her, just enough to make the space around her shrink. "Do you have any idea what those were worth?" Ava felt the tray edge bite into her palm. She could have said she knew exactly what they were worth, because Mrs. Hargrove used to leave jewelry catalogs on the sunroom table, because value was always floating through this house in numbers too large to belong to ordinary people. But what rose in her chest was not anger. Not yet. It was something more fragile. The knowledge that no answer she gave would matter. "I didn't steal from you," she said again, each word steady now, because when you had nothing else left, sometimes you held on to the shape of a sentence. Someone near the fireplace coughed into a napkin. A woman in emerald satin looked down at her shoes. Noah did not move. Charles stared at Ava for a long moment, and in his face she saw not doubt, not even curiosity, but insult, the deep offense of a man unaccustomed to being contradicted in his own home. "You're finished." "Here," he said. The words landed harder than shouting would have. "Sir, collect your things. Leave the uniform. Mrs. Doyle will mail your final check." Ava blinked once. The tree lights blurred, then sharpened. She became aware of absurd details. Melted wax in a brass candle cup, the faint mark of a child's hand on the banister, the way one of the ornaments reflected her back in a warped gold oval, small and dark and alone in the middle of all that polished light. "It's Christmas Eve," she said before she could stop herself. Charles's expression did not change. "Then I suggest you find somewhere else to be." The sentence hung there, immaculate and cruel. No one challenged him. No one said perhaps we should look again. No one asked why the newest maid would steal diamonds in a room full of witnesses. The music had finally been turned off. All Ava could hear now was the low hum of the heating system and the dry whisper of garland moving in the vented air. She set the silver tray on a side table with careful hands because dropping it would have felt too much like breaking. Then she untied her white apron, folded it once, and placed it beside the tray. When she looked up, Noah was still on the stairs. His eyes were wide, not with fear exactly, but with the awful understanding children have when adults destroy something they can never quite put back. Ava gave him the smallest nod, something tender and almost invisible. "Merry Christmas," it said, "even here, even now." Then she turned toward the service hallway, shoulders straight, while behind her the richest man in the room lifted his empty glass and stood beneath the lights like he had just restored order to his world. The service hallway felt colder than the ballroom, even though the heat ran through every vent in the house. Ava Brooks walked past shelves lined with folded tablecloths and silver polish, past the laundry room where steam still clung to the glass pane in the door, past the narrow back staircase the guests never used. Her steps were quiet on the tile, but inside her chest everything sounded too loud. Her heartbeat, her breathing, the words "collect your things," repeating with that polished certainty only money seemed to teach. In the staff room, a small lamp glowed beside a plastic nativity scene someone had set on top of the lockers. Mary was missing one hand. Baby Jesus had been taped back into the manger with clear office tape. On the counter, next to a box of powdered creamer and a stack of paper cups, sat a plate of sugar cookies shaped like stars. One had blue icing smeared across the edge where somebody had grabbed it in a rush. Ava stood there for a second, coatless, staring at those little ordinary things as if they belonged to a life she had just stepped out of and would never get back. Then she opened her locker. Inside was a drugstore lip balm, a pair of knit gloves with one fingertip unraveling, a bus pass, and a Christmas card from her mother folded around $20 she had refused to spend. She picked up her bag and the cheap wool coat she had worn to work that morning, the one that still held a faint trace of rain from the bus stop. Her hands moved carefully, methodically. That was the strange part. Her body knew how to finish a shift even when the shift had ended by humiliation. Mrs. Doyle, the house manager, appeared in the doorway with her mouth pressed into a line so thin it almost disappeared. She was in her late 50s, always neat, always efficient, the type of woman who could spot dust on a chandelier from 20 feet away. Tonight, her eyes looked tired. "Ava," she said softly. Just her name. No speech after it. No defense before it. Ava nodded once because she could not trust her voice yet. Mrs. Doyle held out a plain white envelope. "Your wages through today. The rest will be mailed." Ava took it and felt the shape of a check inside, stiff as cardboard. "Thank you," she said, because dignity sometimes sounded a lot like routine. Mrs. Doyle glanced down the hall before lowering her voice. "I did not make this decision." Ava almost smiled at that, but there was no room for it in her face. "I know who did." The older woman inhaled like she wanted to say more, something honest, maybe even kind, but the air in that house was full of ceilings. "There is a storm getting worse out there," she said instead. "Wait 5 minutes before you go. The driver is taking 2 of the caterers down the hill." Ava shook her head. If she waited, she might cry. If she cried there, under fluorescent lights and the buzz of a tired vending machine, this night would take something else from her too. "I will be all right." Mrs. Doyle looked at her for a long second, then reached toward the plate on the counter and wrapped 2 sugar cookies in a napkin. She placed them in Ava's hand with a quick, embarrassed motion, as if kindness had to move fast before someone important saw it. "Merry Christmas," she said. Ava swallowed the ache rising into her throat. "Merry Christmas." She slung her bag over her shoulder and stepped into the back corridor that led to the garage entrance. Halfway there, she heard the softest sound behind her. "Miss Ava." She turned. Noah stood at the end of the hall in socks, his blazer gone now, his white dress shirt wrinkled at the collar. In the bright service light he looked younger than he had on the stairs, all sharp bones and careful silence. He held something in his hand, folded twice. Ava glanced past him automatically, but no one was there. The music had started again in the distant rooms, thinner now, as if the party itself knew something had soured. Noah crossed the hall, and held out the folded paper. "You forgot this," he said. Ava took it, though she had never seen it before. The paper was warm from his hand. "What is it?" she asked. He looked down, not at her face, but at the buttons on her coat. "It is for you. I was going to give it to you later." She unfolded it. The card was cut from green construction paper, the edges uneven, the front marked with silver marker that had bled into the fibers. It read, in careful block letters, "Thank you for being kind." Inside was a small drawing of a coffee mug with steam rising out of it, and below that, in a child's slanted handwriting, "For when mornings feel sad." Ava pressed her lips together hard enough to stop them trembling. She thought of the breakfast room, of cinnamon in a little white bowl, of Noah watching her like kindness was something almost impossible to trust. "This is beautiful," she said. Noah nodded, but his eyes were glassy. "You did not take it." It was not a question. It was the plain truth from the only person in the house with no power to make it matter. Ava crouched just enough to be closer to his height, though her knees shook with the effort. "No," she said gently. "I did not." He looked toward the ballroom, where laughter rose again, brittle and bright. He does not listen when he is embarrassed. The sentence was too old for him, too practiced. Ava felt something shift in her chest, not breaking this time, but settling into a harder shape. "Then one day," she said, folding the card and tucking it carefully into her bag, "he will have to." Noah stared at her, as if he wanted to believe that. Then a voice called his name from somewhere deeper in the house, sharp and impatient. He flinched almost invisibly. Ava stood and smoothed the front of her coat. She wanted to say something that would fix things, something warm enough to leave behind in a place built on coldness, but all she had was honesty. "Go on," she whispered. "It is all right." Noah did not move at first. Then he stepped back, small in the long corridor, and gave her a nod so solemn it made him look for a second like the man he might become. Ava turned, opened the back door, and walked into the night. The wind hit her first, clean and fierce, carrying snow across the long black driveway in silver sheets. Her coat was too thin for weather like this. The hill down from the estate looked steeper in the dark. Behind her, the Hargrove house blazed with light, every window golden, every wreath perfect, every room pretending nothing had happened at all. Ava stood on the top step with the check in one pocket and a child's Christmas card in the other, and for the first time that night, she understood exactly what they had taken from her and exactly what they had not. By the time Ava reached the bus stop at the bottom of the hill, the snow had turned fine and hard, like salt thrown across the dark. The Hargrove estate was no longer visible except for a faint wash of gold at the top of the road, blurred behind bare trees and iron fencing. Down here, everything looked ordinary again. A gas station with one flickering sign, a mailbox leaning slightly to the left, tire tracks fading under fresh white powder. Ava stood under the narrow plastic shelter and pulled her coat tighter, though the wind still found its way through the seams and settled cold against her skin. She checked the bus schedule posted behind scratched plexiglass, even though she already knew it by heart. Christmas Eve service was thinner. The next bus would not come for 28 minutes. Her fingers were stiff, but she reached into her bag anyway and touched the folded green card Noah had given her, just to make sure it was real. "Thank you for being kind." The silver marker had bled into the paper, and somehow that made it feel more precious, not less. Across the street, the gas station windows glowed under fluorescent light. A teenage cashier in a Santa hat was restocking potato chips, while a radio near the register played an old holiday song with too much cheer in it. Somewhere farther down the road, a siren rose and faded. Ava looked at the white envelope in her hand and finally opened it. The check inside was exactly what Mrs. Doyle had said it would be. Wages through today, measured down to the hour, the number printed neat and final in the corner. No note. No apology. No mention of the accusation that had cost her the job. She stared at the amount for a long moment, then slid the check back into the envelope and tucked it deep into her bag beside the card. Rent was due in a week. The electric bill sat on the kitchen table at home with a red notice on it. Her mother had been stretching shifts at St. Agnes Medical Center for months, taking overnight floor cleaning work because the hospital paid $1.80 more after 11. Between the two of them, they kept the apartment warm, the lights on, and enough food in the fridge to call it getting by. Most weeks, that counted as a victory. Tonight it felt smaller than it had yesterday. The bus pulled up 10 minutes late with a hiss of wet brakes and a wash of yellow light across the snow. Ava climbed aboard, tapped her pass, and moved to a seat halfway back. The heater roared overhead, too hot and dusty, smelling faintly of rubber and old coats. Only 6 other passengers were on board. A tired woman with a grocery bag between her boots. A young couple speaking softly in Spanish near the rear door. An older man asleep by the window with a wrapped present balanced in his lap. The city slid by in fragments of red taillights and half-lit porches, in laundromats still open and church signs glowing over empty lots. Ava leaned her temple against the cold glass and watched storefronts pass in long streaks. Every now and then her reflection appeared in the window over the dark outside. Her face looked older than it had that morning. Not changed exactly, just stripped down to the parts that lasted. At the transfer stop near East Warren, she switched to the number 12 and rode the last 20 minutes to the apartment complex she had lived in since she was 14. The building was brick, for stories, built in the 1960s and aging without grace. The front step had been salted badly, the crystals gathered in uneven white piles. Someone had wrapped the lobby rail in green tinsel, and one strand had already come loose and dragged across the floor like seaweed. Ava climbed to the 3rd floor, hearing television noise through thin walls and the muffled bark of a dog in Unit 3B. When she unlocked the apartment door, the first thing that met her was the smell of onions and black pepper. Then the soft hum of the old refrigerator. Then her mother, standing in the kitchen in blue scrubs with a gray cardigan over them, wooden spoon still in hand. Lorraine Brooks did not ask why Ava was home early. Mothers who had lived hard enough learned to read disaster from the way a hand held a bag, from the silence before hello. She turned off the burner under the pot on the stove and set the spoon down on a folded dish towel. "Baby," she said, and the word came out low and careful, like she was stepping toward a frightened animal. Ava shut the door behind her, but she did not move from it. Snow still clung to her coat hem in tiny melting stars. The apartment was warm, but she could not stop shivering. On the counter sat a foil pan of cornbread dressing, a bowl of canned cranberry sauce Lorraine had tried to dress up with orange zest, and a tiny artificial tree with one string of multicolored lights, 2 of them burned out. It was not much by rich people standards. It was everything they had. Ava looked at all of it, the patched pot holder by the oven, the dish drainer with one cracked plate, the magnet on the fridge that said "Faith makes a way," and something in her face finally gave way. "He fired me," she said. Lorraine did not ask who. She already knew where Ava had been, what kind of house it was, what kind of man lived inside it. She crossed the kitchen in 3 quick steps and took Ava into her arms. Ava pressed her face into her mother's shoulder and felt the rough knit of the cardigan against her cheek, smelled bleach and hospital soap, and the little bit of vanilla lotion Lorraine always used because she said everyone deserved one good scent in life. "For what?" her mother asked quietly. Ava pulled back enough to breathe. "He said I stole something." Lorraine's hands tightened around her for just 1 second. Then she leaned away and looked straight at her daughter, all the warmth in her face sharpening into something stronger. "Did you?" Ava almost laughed from the sheer impossibility of the question, from the fact that truth still mattered enough in this apartment to be asked plainly. "No," Lorraine nodded once. "Then that is his sin, not yours." The words settled into the room with more weight than anything Charles Hargrove had said all night. Ava took off her coat and laid it over the back of a chair. The green card slipped from her bag, and Lorraine bent to pick it up. She read the front, then the inside, then looked up slowly. "A child gave you this." Ava nodded. "His son." Lorraine ran her thumb over the silver letters, careful not to smear them. "Then somebody in that house can still see." Ava sank into the kitchen chair nearest the radiator, suddenly too tired to hold herself upright the way she had all evening. The radiator clicked and hissed beside her. From the apartment downstairs came the faint sound of somebody laughing at a television sitcom. Outside, snow tapped softly against the window. Lorraine set a bowl of stew in front of Ava, without asking if she was hungry. "Eat first," she said. "Then cry if you need to, but not before you eat." Ava looked down at the steam curling from the bowl, at the carrots cut too thick and the broth that had stretched 1 pound of beef farther than it should have gone. She picked up the spoon with unsteady fingers. The first bite was too hot, salty, ordinary, perfect. It nearly undid her. Lorraine sat across from her with Noah's card still in her hand, the tiny tree lights blinking red, green, gold against the dark kitchen window, and for the first time since the ballroom, Ava felt the night stop spinning long enough for one clear thought to land. They had sent her out into the cold, but they had not sent her out empty. That night, after the dishes were washed and stacked in the rack to dry, after Lorraine taped plastic over the drafty corner of the living room window and checked the deadbolt the way she always did before bed, Ava sat alone at the kitchen table with the overhead light turned low. The apartment had gone quiet in layers. First the television in the next unit clicked off. Then the plumbing pipes gave one last shudder through the wall. Then even the wind outside seemed to settle, leaving only the radiator's soft hiss and the occasional tick from the dollar store clock above the stove. In front of her sat three things: the envelope with her final check, Noah's green Christmas card, and a yellow legal pad her mother used to write down bills. Ava had turned to the first blank page and written one sentence across the top in careful print. This will not be the end of my story. She had not known what would come after it. She still did not. But the words looked steadier on paper than they felt inside her chest, and for the moment, that was enough. She picked up the card again and ran her thumb along the silver ink where it had bled into the green construction paper. Thank you for being kind. The line was simple, almost childishly so, but it carried a strange weight. In the Hargrove house, kindness had been treated like decoration, something nice to have around as long as it never interfered with power. Here, at a kitchen table with one chair that wobbled and a crack in the laminate no amount of scrubbing could erase, kindness was not decoration. It was structure. It held things up when money could not. Ava folded the card carefully and placed it inside the front cover of the legal pad, as if she were filing away a piece of evidence from a life nobody else would believe. Then she uncapped a blue pen and began writing beneath the sentence: community college, night classes, business administration, accounting, scholarships, temporary work, no debt if possible. The words came slowly at first, then faster, each one less like a dream and more like a brick. She had always been good with numbers. Mrs. Doyle used to joke that Ava could inventory a pantry in one glance and remember what was missing 3 days later. At the apartment complex, neighbors asked her to read over payment plans and insurance notices because she could spot the hidden fees before they could. She knew how systems moved. More important, she knew how they failed. Tonight proved that. In certain rooms, truth did not matter unless it arrived wearing a title. Fine, she thought. Then one day she would walk into those rooms with one. The pen stopped. She stared at the page, suddenly aware of how impossible it all looked. Tuition cost money. Books cost money. Time cost money. Everything cost money, and she had just lost the job that helped keep the refrigerator full. For a long minute she sat there with her hand wrapped around the pen, listening to the refrigerator hum and the old building settle around her, and doubt moved in quietly, the way cold moved through window seams. It did not shout. It whispered. It told her she was tired, that she was 22, that women like her were expected to recover quietly and return to work wherever work would still take them. It reminded her of every application she had filled out that never led anywhere better, every time she had been complimented for being so articulate, every moment someone had looked right through her and called it normal. Ava lowered her eyes to the check in the envelope. The amount was not enough for ambition. It was barely enough for survival. Still, she took the legal pad and drew a line down the center of the page. On the left she wrote what I have. On the right she wrote what I need. Under what I have she listed one winter coat, one high school diploma, bus pass, references from 2 families before the Hargroves, strong work ethic, no criminal record, ability to learn fast, mother who believes in me. When she reached the last line, she paused, then added one child who saw the truth. It made her smile, but only for a second. Under what I need she wrote everything else. Tuition assistance, better job, sleep, time, grace, courage. She stared at the final word until the letters looked almost strange. Courage. People like to talk about courage as if it was loud, as if it arrived in speeches and dramatic exits. Tonight it looked different. Tonight it looked like not letting another person's contempt become your identity. A floorboard creaked behind her. Lorraine stood in the doorway in her nightgown and cardigan, gray hair wrapped in a satin scarf, one hand resting lightly on the frame. It is after 1 in the morning, she said, her voice still thick with sleep. Are you planning to solve the whole world before sunrise? Ava let out a small breath that almost became a laugh. Just my corner of it. Lorraine stepped into the kitchen and looked down at the legal pad. Her eyes moved over the page, over the 2 columns, the lists, the hard little shape of determination trying to become a future. She did not say it was too much. She did not say to be realistic. She pulled out the chair across from Ava and sat down slowly, her knees giving that familiar complaint of long shifts and too many years on tile floors. When I was 19, she said, I wanted to be a nurse. Ava looked up. She knew pieces of her mother's history, but not all of it. In families built on overtime, stories often came in fragments. Lorraine folded her hands on the table. I had the grades. I had the acceptance letter. Then your grandmother got sick, and the rent went up, and life started naming its price. I told myself I would go next year. Then next year became work, and work became years. She touched the legal pad gently with one finger. There is nothing wrong with honest work. But there is also nothing holy about staying small, because somebody else feels safer that way. Ava felt her throat tighten. Lorraine reached into the pocket of her cardigan and laid 2 $20 bills on the table. This is grocery money, Ava said. This, Lorraine corrected, nudging the bills toward her, is the first line of a better plan. Ava blinked at the folded bills, then back at her mother. Mama, no. Baby, yes. The tree lights in the living room cast small red and green reflections across the kitchen wall. Somewhere outside, a plow scraped slowly down the street. Lorraine leaned back in her chair and studied her daughter with the tired, unsentimental love of a woman who had seen too much to confuse comfort with protection. Let me tell you something, she said. Men like Charles Hargrove think they are the authors of every room they enter. They think if they throw you out of one chapter, your story is over. But all they really control is the page they are standing on. You hear me? Ava nodded, but tears had already started gathering in her eyes. Lorraine pointed lightly to the sentence at the top of the page. Then write the next line. Ava swallowed, lowered her pen, and beneath this will not be the end of my story, she wrote in smaller, firmer letters. 10 years if I have to. 20 if I must. But I will not stay where he left me. When she finished, the room was still. Not empty. Still. The kind of stillness that comes right before something takes root. Ava set the pen down and looked at the words until they stopped feeling like anger and started feeling like a vow. In the bedroom, the cheap space heater clicked on. In the sink, one spoon settled with a tiny metallic tap. And at a kitchen table under a dim light, with $40, a child's Christmas card, and a future that did not yet know her name, Ava Brooks quietly began. The next morning did not feel like the beginning of anything. It felt like December 25th in a third-floor apartment where the coffee maker sputtered before it worked, where one burner on the stove ran too hot, and another barely warmed, where the world outside the window looked white and clean while inside everything still carried the shape of last night. Ava woke before dawn anyway. For a moment she lay still under 2 blankets listening to the building breathe around her, to the muffled thud of somebody moving furniture upstairs, to the faraway groan of a city bus turning through slush. Then she remembered, not in words, in weight, in the heavy, immediate knowledge that she did not have to put on a black work dress or catch the 6:15 bus or make herself small in a house built to remind people like her where they stood. She stared at the faint line of blue light under her bedroom shade and let the truth settle all the way in. She had been thrown out of one life. That did not mean she had no life left. In the kitchen, Lorraine was already awake, standing at the stove in fuzzy socks and her old choir sweatshirt, frying turkey sausage in a pan that popped softly at the edges. The little artificial tree on the counter blinked red, green, and gold with stubborn cheer. A gospel station played low from the radio by the sink, one singer carrying a note so full and warm it seemed to push back against the cold glass of the windows. Lorraine turned when Ava came in and held up a spatula. "Merry Christmas," she said, and the words were not bright exactly, but deliberate, like laying a clean cloth over something damaged and refusing to call it ruined. Ava kissed her mother on the cheek and poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs, one with a faded sunflower painted on the side, the other with St. Agnes Medical Center printed in blue block letters. Steam rose between them. On the table sat the legal pad from last night, still open to the page with its 2 columns and its vow written across the top in steady handwriting. Next to it was a cereal box Lorraine had flattened and cut into a makeshift folder so the card from Noah would not bend. Ava noticed that and felt a quiet warmth move through her chest. Her mother did not say much over breakfast. That was her way when pain was fresh. She did not crowd it with advice before it had shape. They ate sausage, scrambled eggs, and toast with strawberry jam from the discount grocery on Jefferson. The food was simple and hot, and enough. Afterward, Lorraine tied on an apron and started rinsing collard greens for dinner, and Ava sat back down at the table with the legal pad, a library pen she had. Borrowed 3 months ago and never returned, and the kind of focus that comes when hurt finally stops spinning and begins to harden into direction. She wrote out deadlines. January enrollment dates for community college. Financial aid office. Application fee waiver. Evening class schedule. She listed every person she knew who might give a reference. Mrs. Kenner from the duplex on Baldwin, who had trusted Ava with her twins for 2 summers. Mr. Ruiz from church, who ran shipping at a tool company and always said Ava had a head for logistics. Even Mrs. Doyle, maybe, if courage held. By noon she had called the college and listened to a recorded message about holiday hours. She had written down office extensions anyway. She had looked up tuition in the course catalog Lorraine kept under old magazines because she believed information should have a place to live. She had circled associate degree in business administration 3 times. It did not sound glamorous. Good. Glamour had never fed anybody she knew. What it sounded like was useful. What it sounded like was movement. In the afternoon, while the roast cooked and the apartment filled with the smell of garlic, onion, and paprika, Ava walked to the laundromat 2 blocks over to pick up an extra shift she had heard about from the woman in Unit 2C. The owner, Mrs. Petrov, wore a Santa brooch on her sweater and spoke in the clipped, efficient tone of somebody who respected workers more than charm. She needed help from 4 until closing because her nephew had called in sick. Ava said yes before she heard the hourly pay. When Mrs. Petrov named it, low but honest, Ava nodded as if the number did not press against every bill in her bag. By 4 o'clock, she was wiping down folding tables under fluorescent lights, the air warm with detergent and dryer heat. A television mounted in the corner showed a parade nobody was really watching. Children in puffy coats chased each other between carts while their mothers called after them not to run. A man fed quarters into a machine with one hand while balancing a toddler on his hip with the other. Life, Ava thought, did not stop because somebody powerful had misjudged you. It just kept asking what you planned to do next. Around 6, while she was restocking the vending machine with peanut butter crackers and canned soda, she caught her reflection in the glass. Same brown skin. Same steady eyes. Same woman he had looked at and decided was disposable. Yet standing there in the hum of dryers and the smell of clean cotton, she understood something he never would have bothered learning. Work did not define dignity. The absence of dignity in others did. She finished her shift at 10 with sore feet and lint on her sleeves. Mrs. Petrov paid in cash, folded into an envelope with Ava's name spelled carefully across the front. "You are efficient," she said. "Come tomorrow if you want more hours." Ava thanked her and stepped back out into the cold, carrying $38.20, enough to matter. The sidewalks glittered under old salt and streetlight. Somewhere nearby, somebody had set off one lonely firework late and cheap, a brief scatter of gold over the rooftops. When she got home, Lorraine had left a plate covered in foil in the oven and a note beside it that read, "Eat, then sleep. We build tomorrow too." Ava smiled before she could stop herself. She ate at the kitchen table with her coat still on, then opened the cereal box folder and looked once more at Noah's card. "Thank you for being kind." She set it beside the envelope from the laundromat, one small proof of who she was and one small proof of what she could still make. Outside, Christmas was almost over. Inside, the apartment was quiet except for the tick of the wall clock and the low click of the heater. Ava placed both hands flat on the table and let the stillness fill up around her. She had no miracle, no rescue, no rich person suddenly regretting what they had done. What she had was a plan, a mother, 2 jobs if she was willing, and a mind that had finally stopped waiting for fairness to arrive first. That night, before she turned out the light, she wrote one more line on the yellow pad beneath her vow. "I do not need their permission to become more." 10 years did not pass in a straight line. They passed in bus schedules and overdue notices, in coffee gone cold beside library books, in winters that scraped the skin dry and summers that made the apartment windows stick in their frames. They passed. In the blue glow of vending machines at midnight and the stale brightness of classroom fluorescence after a 10-hour shift, Ava Brooks learned very quickly that becoming somebody new rarely looked dramatic from the inside. Most days it looked like carrying too much and refusing to drop any of it. The first spring after Christmas Eve, she enrolled at Wayne County Community College for 2 evening classes and paid the last of the fee in cash that smelled faintly of detergent from the laundromat. She worked mornings at a diner on Gresham, afternoons twice a week at Mrs. Petrov's, and weekends filling in wherever somebody called out sick. Her shoes were thin at the heels. Her hands grew rough from bleach and hot water and cheap winter air. But every Tuesday and Thursday night, she sat in a classroom with a spiral notebook open and wrote down terms like managerial accounting, supply chain, cash flow analysis, and organizational behavior, as if each one were a rung on a ladder only she could see. At first, people underestimated her in small, familiar ways. A classmate once asked if she was sure she was in the right room before the statistics midterm. A customer at the diner slid his credit card past her and said, slow and smiling, "You seem smart. But you could do more than this someday." As if he were inventing the thought for her. Ava learned to keep her face neutral and let competence answer before anger did. By year 2, she had the highest grade in Intro to Finance, a recommendation from Professor Elaine Murphy, and a new habit of reading annual reports on the bus while the city blurred past in brake lights and slush. Professor Murphy was the first person in a long time who looked at Ava's questions and heard not just intelligence, but direction. "You do not think like a student," she told her one night after class while erasing the whiteboard. "You think like somebody already inside the machinery." Ava smiled at that. Machinery, she understood. Machines broke in patterns. So did companies. By the time she finished her associate degree, Lorraine had pinned the certificate to the refrigerator with 2 magnets and cried over it like it was a Pulitzer Prize. Ava transferred to Michigan State on scholarship and commuted whenever she could not afford to stay near campus. Some days, she spent 4 hours in transit and called it strategy. She interned with a regional logistics firm where nobody could remember her name during the first month and everybody asked for her spreadsheet model by the third. She learned how men in expensive watches took credit without blinking, how meetings changed temperature when she spoke too directly, how being the smartest person in the room and being treated like it were still 2 different things. She also learned how to prepare so thoroughly that doubt had nowhere to sit. She checked every figure twice. She walked into interviews knowing the revenue history of companies she had never worked for. She built a reputation the old-fashioned way, with detail and time and the kind of steadiness that made other people's shortcuts look flimsy. The years kept moving. Lorraine's hair went softer and grayer. Noah's Christmas card stayed in a frame on Ava's desk no matter where she lived, first in the apartment, then in a tiny 1-bedroom with radiator heat near Midtown, then on the narrow shelf of a shared office after graduate school. She never forgot the card because it reminded her of 2 things at once, the wound and the witness. When life got mean, as it sometimes did, she looked at those silver letters and remembered that truth did not always disappear just because power talked over it. At 28, she was hired by Holt Consulting, a turnaround firm with a reputation for taking on struggling companies too proud to admit they were in trouble until the walls were already leaning. The hours were brutal. The expectations were worse. Her first boss, a narrow man named Kenneth Pike who believed sleep was laziness with better branding, handed her a 70-page operations review on a Friday and said he needed her notes by Monday morning. Ava gave him the marked-up binder by Sunday at noon. He flipped through it in silence, stopped at page 32, then looked up over his glasses. "Who taught you to see like this?" he asked. Ava thought of inventory shelves, overdue bills, bus routes, and a velvet box held up under a Christmas tree like a verdict. "Life," she said. Holt sent her into factories with failing schedules and hospitals bleeding money and retail chains drowning in waste. She walked through loading docks that smelled like diesel and cardboard, conference rooms with dying ficus plants, break rooms where workers looked at her with suspicion until they realized she listened better than she talked. She had a way of seeing where loss hid, not just in numbers but in habits, in ego, in the expensive lies people told to avoid changing. Once, in St. Louis, she spent 3 days tracing a budget discrepancy no one else thought was worth the trouble and uncovered a procurement scheme that had been draining 6 figures a quarter. Another time, in Cleveland, she saved a distribution center by changing one shipping sequence nobody at headquarters had bothered to ask floor staff about. Her reputation grew in that quiet, cumulative way real reputations do. Not with headlines. With callbacks. With a partner forwarding her name before clients asked for her twice. With phrases like sharp under pressure, unusually disciplined, and trusted by operations teams landing in internal reviews. She did not become soft, but she became precise. She did not forget what humiliation felt like, but she stopped wearing it like a fresh bruise and started using it like a compass. Whenever she faced a room full of men who assumed authority had a certain look, she let them underestimate her for exactly as long as it helped. Then she spoke. At 32, she was promoted to senior managing director after leading the rescue of a manufacturing group everyone else had privately written off. Lorraine took her out for catfish and sweet tea at a place with vinyl booths and called her baby every third sentence until the waitress started smiling each time she passed the table. That night, back in her apartment, Ava kicked off her heels, loosened the collar of her cream blouse, and stood by the window with the city spread out below in amber light and moving red tail lamps. Her office bag lay open on the couch, papers spilling out beside her laptop. On the shelf near the lamp, Noah's card leaned against a framed photo of her and Lorraine at graduation. The silver marker had faded a little over the years, but the words were still legible. "Thank you for being kind." Ava picked it up and held it for a moment, thumb resting on the crease. She wondered sometimes what had become of that boy, whether he had grown into the kind of man who listened when people without power spoke. Then, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was nearly 10, too late for anything casual. She set down the card and crossed the room. The email was from Margaret Ellis, chair of a board Ava knew by name and reputation, the kind of woman newspapers described as immovable and somehow meant it as praise. The subject line was brief, confidential inquiry. Ava opened it and read the first sentence once, then again more slowly. A major corporation was in distress. Revenue erosion. Hidden liabilities suspected. Leadership instability. The board required discretion, speed, and someone with turnaround credibility strong enough to survive internal resistance. They were requesting a meeting in New York after the holidays. Ava stood very still in the light of the refrigerator and read the company name at the bottom. Hargrove Global. Charles Hargrove had spent 10 years building the kind of face that did not flinch in public. It was one of the reasons business magazines kept using the same words for him even now, when the shine had begun to wear thin around the edges. Steady, relentless, visionary. The photographs still helped. Tailored suits. White hair cut close. A jaw set like old money had carved it itself. But photographs could not catch the silence in a boardroom after bad numbers landed. They could not catch the way a man's hand lingered half a beat too long on a water glass when he was buying time. On the top floor of Hargrove Global's Manhattan headquarters, silence had become its own department. It lived in the polished conference table, in the expensive gray carpet that muffled footsteps, in the 20-foot windows that looked out over a city too busy to care if one empire was beginning to crack. Charles stood at the head of the table while a slide deck glowed behind him in cold blue bars and downward arrows. Quarterly revenue down again. Luxury retail underperforming. Supply chain overruns. Debt exposure larger than forecast. The words on the screen were tidy enough to pass for temporary trouble, but everyone in the room knew the truth had started smelling stronger than the perfume of denial. Margaret Ellis sat 3 seats to his left, still as carved stone in a cream jacket, one silver bracelet resting against her wrist like a line drawn under patience. Across from her sat 2 other independent directors and the firm's outside counsel. Stephen Hale, now chief financial officer and every bit as sleek as he had been when he was younger, clicked to the next slide with the easy confidence of a man who had learned how to survive by sounding certain 5 minutes longer than everyone else. Seasonal softness amplified by market hesitation, he said. Our fundamentals remain strong. Charles did not interrupt, though the phrase irritated him on contact. Fundamentals remain strong. It was the language people used when foundations were shifting under their feet and nobody wanted to say the floor moved. He looked down at the printed briefing packet in front of him. The paper smelled faintly of toner. His own notes, written in sharp black pen, had become heavier over the last year. Too many question marks. Too many words like why and again and unacceptable. Hargrove Global had once been simpler, cleaner. Luxury hospitality, premium real estate, selective retail holdings, all wrapped in a brand that sold aspiration to people willing to finance it. He had always believed in surfaces because surfaces were where judgment started. If you controlled the way things appeared, you bought yourself time before anyone asked what they were made of. It had worked for decades. Then the market changed. Shipping costs rose, labor turned volatile, consumer debt tightened, and the younger executives he had once dismissed as restless began using words like transparency and operational drag in meetings with investors. Charles had not enjoyed that. He enjoyed even less the fact that they had been right about some of it. He looked toward Stephen, who was now speaking about restructuring certain liabilities into language polished enough to sound like strategy instead of postponement. Charles had known Stephen a long time. First as a fast-moving junior finance man with sharp suits and sharper instincts. Then as the sort of executive who anticipated danger early and had an almost supernatural ability to redirect blame before it found him. In better years, that talent looked useful. In worse years, it began to look expensive. What exactly are we not saying? Margaret asked, cutting cleanly through the room. Her voice was low, but it landed with the weight of metal. Stephen paused, one hand still resting on the remote. I am not sure I follow. I am sure you do, Margaret said. She did not raise her voice. She never needed to. We have had 3/4 of optimistic framing, 2 internal control concerns, 1 delayed disclosure issue, and a stock decline that no longer fits inside weather language. So I will ask a simpler question. What exactly is the size of the rot? Nobody moved for a second. Outside the window, a helicopter crossed the river in a slow, dark line. Charles felt his jaw tighten. He should have answered. It was his company, his name on the building, his decades in the mortar. But the thing about decline was that it hollowed authority from the inside first, and only later did it show on the walls. Stephen cleared his throat. The underlying business is still viable. That was not the question, Margaret said. Charles stepped in then, not to defend Stephen, not really, but to reclaim the room before it slipped. We have headwinds, he said. We have a few pockets of inefficiency that have not corrected quickly enough. We are addressing them. Even to his own ears, it sounded older than it used to. A prepared sentence from a younger decade. Margaret turned to him fully. Her gaze did not carry malice. That would have been easier to dismiss. What it carried was decision. Charles, she said, we are past addressing. We are now in the part where this either gets rebuilt honestly or collapses expensively. The words hung there. No one touched their coffee. Charles looked past her toward the city and felt, for one strange instant, not anger but fatigue. The kind that comes when pride has been holding up more beams than it should. In the reflection on the window, he saw himself as the room saw him now. Still impressive from across the glass, but older in the details. The slight slackness beneath the eyes. The silver spreading at the temples. The pause before certainty. 10 years earlier, he would have taken offense first and inventory second. Now offense had begun to feel like a luxury the numbers could no longer afford. What are you proposing? He asked. Margaret folded her hands over the briefing packet. A full turnaround. Independent review. Leadership changes as needed. Charles felt the word before he reacted to it. Changes. It moved through the room like a draft under a door. Stephen shifted almost invisibly in his seat. Outside counsel looked down at his notes. One of the directors removed his glasses and polished them even though they were not dirty. You are not replacing me, Charles said. Margaret held his gaze. I am saying the company may not survive your pride. There it was. Not shouted. Worse. Said plainly enough to be true. Charles looked toward Stephen, expecting some immediate alignment, some defense built from loyalty or self-preservation. Stephen only adjusted his cuff and said, the market would respond favorably to decisive action. The betrayal was elegant, almost bloodless. Charles stared at him for half a second longer than necessary and understood more in that pause than in the last 6 months of reports. Men like Stephen never stood beside power because they believed in it. They stood beside it because it cast useful shade. The meeting ended without ceremony. Papers gathered. Chairs slid back. Quiet voices resumed. Margaret remained seated until the others left, then rose and stepped beside him at the window. The board will not let this drift into spring, she said. We are bringing in outside leadership. Charles let the city hold his stare. Some consultant with a spine and a resume? Margaret's expression did not change. Someone who knows how to walk into a burning structure and tell the truth before it falls. He almost said something dismissive. Almost. But the numbers in the packet had taken that tone away from him. Below, the avenue moved in ribbons of yellow cabs and black-town cars. Somewhere 39 floors down, a doorman opened a glass door for people who would never think about debt covenants or board votes or old mistakes. Charles could smell the faint leather of the chairs, the bitter edge of coffee gone cold, the ghost of cologne Stephen always wore 2 notes too sharp. Who is it? He asked. Margaret picked up her folder. You will meet her after the holiday week. Her use of the pronoun landed so lightly it might have passed unnoticed by anyone else. It did not pass unnoticed by Charles. He turned his head a fraction. Her. Margaret nodded once. You asked for the best chance the company has. That is what we found. Then she walked out, leaving him alone in a boardroom built to project control while the winter light turned the windows the color of old steel. Charles stood there until the room dimmed around him, one hand resting on the back of his chair, and tried not to feel what had just entered the building before it had even arrived. Judgment, yes, but something worse than judgment too. Consequence. Margaret Ellis chose a hotel suite instead of a boardroom for the first meeting, and Ava understood the strategy the moment she stepped inside. Boardrooms made people perform. Suites made them reveal themselves when they thought they were being careful. The room was on the 26th floor of the Langford, all winter light and quiet money, with cream walls, dark walnut trim, and a view of Midtown blurred behind a thin veil of afternoon snow. A tray of untouched coffee sat on the low table beside a bowl of green apples polished to a shine no one would trust if they looked too closely. Ava set her leather portfolio on the armchair nearest the window and took in the room with the same practiced attention she used in factories and executive offices alike. 2 exits. One mirror positioned to make the room look larger. Fresh flowers beginning to turn at the outer edges. Margaret liked control, but she also liked signs of life staying honest. Good. Ava preferred honest rooms. She wore a charcoal suit with a clean white blouse and small gold studs Lorraine had given her after graduate school, the kind of earrings that did not try to announce anything and still never looked cheap. Her hair was pulled back smooth at the nape of her neck. The framed copy of Noah's card was not with her, of course, but before leaving Detroit that morning she had touched the edge of the frame the way some people touched a cross or a photograph. Not for luck, for alignment. Margaret entered 3 minutes later carrying a folder thick enough to suggest trouble and a thin enough smile to suggest she had finally found the person she wanted. Ms. Brooks, she said. Thank you for coming on short notice. Ava stood and shook her hand. Margaret's grip was dry and direct. I appreciate the discretion, Ava said. Margaret set the folder down and glanced once at the coffee tray. I am told you do your best work when other people are already pretending there is no fire. Ava let a small smile touch one corner of her mouth. That is often when they start telling the truth by accident. Margaret liked that answer. Ava could tell by the way her shoulders relaxed exactly half an inch. They sat across from each other with the winter city stretched pale behind them. For the next 40 minutes, Margaret spoke with the precision of someone who valued facts more than drama, which was fortunate because the facts were dramatic enough. Hargrove Global had layered weak performance under brand prestige for years. Certain divisions were bleeding cash more quietly than the public filings suggested. Vendor obligations had been rolled forward in ways that were legal enough to survive a first glance and dangerous enough to fail a real one. Internal reports were delayed. Forecasts were massaged. Leadership had become reactive, insulated, proud. Insulated by whom? Ava asked. Margaret opened the folder and slid over a page. Chiefly by the people most invested in making decline look temporary. Stephen Hale's name appeared 3 times in 4 pages. Ava did not react outwardly. A younger version of him surfaced in her mind anyway, passing too quickly through a coat room in a house dressed for Christmas, cologne sharp as metal, eyes that never settled anywhere long enough to look guilty. Memory arrived with scent before image. Pine. Polish. Snow on wool. She let the flash move through her and go still. Margaret noticed none of it or pretended not to, which Ava respected. And Charles Hargrove? Ava asked. Margaret folded her hands over one knee. Brilliant once. Possibly still. But pride calcified into management is its own liability. She said it without malice. Just verdict. He built the company into what it became, then mistook legacy for invulnerability. He still thinks authority is a substitute for correction. Ava looked down at the financial summary, her eyes moving over debt ratios, margin compression, delayed impairments, operational redundancies disguised as executive preference. A company could hide weakness inside elegance for a long time if enough people were paid to admire the wallpaper. She had seen versions of this before. What made this different was not the structure of failure. Failure was almost always repetitive. What made this different was the name at the top of every page. Hargrove. She kept her voice level. Why me? Margaret answered without pause. Because everyone else we considered either wanted a title, wanted a payoff, or wanted to preserve the old guard long enough to be liked by it. You have a reputation for preferring the health of the institution to the comfort of the men who damaged it. Ava said nothing for a moment. Outside, a snowplow moved down the avenue below like a bright toy through gray slush. In the room, the coffee cooled untouched. She thought of Lorraine's handwriting on a grocery envelope years ago, reminding her that a better plan did not arrive dressed as ease. She thought of the yellow legal pad and the vow at the top. 10 years if I have to. She thought of the night she learned what it meant for someone powerful to decide who you were without investigation, without curiosity, without consequence. What exactly are you asking? She said. Margaret met her eyes. An interim appointment at first, with board protection and full authority to review every division, every contract, every senior executive. If your findings support what we suspect, the interim title becomes permanent chief executive officer. The room went very quiet after that. Not dramatic quiet. Real quiet. The kind in which a life you once imagined collides with the one standing in front of you, and both refuse to blink first. Ava did not lean back. Did not inhale too sharply. Years of discipline held the moment in place. Does Charles know? Margaret's mouth thinned into something almost like amusement. He knows the board is bringing in outside leadership. He does not know who. And you would prefer to keep it that way until I say yes. I would prefer, Margaret said, to put you in the room before old reflexes have time to organize resistance. Ava rose and crossed to the window, not to be theatrical, but because movement helped her think. Far below, pedestrians pushed through the cold with scarves up and shoulders tucked. Cabs flashed mustard yellow at intersections. A man in a red knit hat stood at a food cart breathing steam into his hands. Ordinary life. Moving under towers where extraordinary damage could be done by polished people in expensive silence. Her reflection hovered faintly in the glass over the city. Charcoal suit. Straight spine. Brown skin lit by winter light. For one suspended second, she saw both women at once. The one who had once stood in a service hallway with cookies wrapped in a napkin and a child's handmade card in her pocket, and the one standing here, now being asked to walk back into the architecture of that old wound wearing authority. It would be easy to call this fate if she believed in easy stories. She did not. She believed in preparation meeting consequence. She turned back to Margaret. If I take this, she said, I take it to tell the truth, not to decorate the transition. Margaret nodded. That is why you are here. And if the truth reaches all the way to the founder, then it reaches him. Ava let the answer settle. Something inside her did not feel triumphant. That surprised her less than it should have. There was no revenge in the room, only weight. Responsibility had a different temperature than fantasy. I have conditions, she said. Independent access to internal audit. No interference with staff interviews. Full review of procurement history for the last decade. Board backing in writing. And I choose my own chief of staff. Margaret did not even pretend to hesitate. Done. Ava almost smiled. You came prepared. So did you, Margaret said. For the first time since arriving, Ava allowed herself to glance at the coffee and actually pick up the cup. It was strong, dark, and slightly bitter from waiting too long on the burner. She set it back down and looked at the folder again, at the familiar name on unfamiliar paper, at the invitation hidden inside collapse. Then she lifted her chin just slightly, the way she used to before entering a classroom after a double shift, before hard conversations, before rooms that had not yet decided whether to respect her and were about to learn. All right, she said. Set the meeting. The boardroom on the 42nd floor had been designed to flatter power. Everything in it reflected someone's idea of permanence. The walnut table gleamed without a fingerprint in sight. The leather chairs were stitched so precisely they looked expensive even in silence. Frosted glass walls softened the edges of movement outside, turning assistants and attorneys into passing shadows. At 8:58 on a gray Monday morning, every seat was filled except one. Charles Hargrove sat at the head of the table with his cuff linked straight, his briefing notes aligned, and his expression arranged into the kind of patience men used when they expected to dislike what was coming but believed they would still control it. To his right sat Stephen Hale, immaculate as ever, a navy tie knotted. With mathematical precision, a silver pen resting parallel to his water glass. Margaret Ellis was already there as well, reviewing a slim folder with no visible concern on her face. Two other directors spoke quietly near the windows. Outside, New York moved under a low January sky, the river the color of cold steel, the rooftops washed pale after an overnight dusting of snow. Charles had slept badly. He had told himself it was the markets, the activists circling, the board's sudden appetite for drama. He had not told himself the truer thing, which was that uncertainty offended him more now than it once had because age had made surprises feel less like inconvenience and more like judgment. "Do we have a name yet?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. Margaret did not look up immediately. "We do." And she closed the folder. "You will meet her in 2 minutes." Charles gave a short, humorless exhale. "You are enjoying this too much." "No," Margaret said. "I am respecting the moment." Stephen smiled faintly, the kind of smile that agreed with whichever power source seemed most stable. "I am sure this will be productive," he said. Charles turned his head just enough to look at him. Productive. Another smooth word men reached for when they wanted to sound useful while waiting to see who survived. Across the table, the digital screen displayed the agenda in neat black lettering. Leadership transition briefing. Immediate stabilization measures. Review of executive authority. Charles disliked all three. He disliked even more that no one in the room seemed especially interested in whether he did. At exactly 9 o'clock, the outer door opened. The assistant stepped in first, murmured, "She is here," and moved aside. Then Ava Brooks entered the room. She did not rush. She did not pause for effect either. She simply walked in with a dark wool coat folded over one arm, a leather portfolio in the other hand, and the kind of composure that made noise rearrange itself around her. Her suit was deep navy, sharply cut, understated enough to signal discipline rather than display. Her blouse was ivory. Her heels were practical and quiet on the floor. The winter light caught the gold at her ears and the smooth line of her hair, but what struck the room first was not style. It was presence. Ava looked toward Margaret, then to the others, taking stock the way experienced people did when they entered contested spaces. Her gaze moved to Charles last. That was when time broke. Not dramatically. Worse. Subtly. The kind of break only the people inside it could feel. Charles stared at her as though memory had been waiting just behind his eyes for 10 years and had finally found the strength to step forward. He knew the face older, of course. Sharper now. More contained. Success had changed the architecture of it, not the foundation. But he knew. He knew the skin he had once watched go still under a Christmas tree while he accused her without proof. He knew the calm in her mouth, the steadiness in her eyes, the unbearable absence of fear. And beneath all of that, he knew the name before anyone said it. Ava. For one suspended second, he smelled pine and furniture polish instead of coffee and leather. Saw snow on a thin coat instead of gray river light on glass. Heard, impossibly clear, the soft sentence she had spoken in his house after he had already made up his mind. "I did not take anything, sir." The boardroom remained silent long enough for everyone in it to feel the temperature change. Stephen's fingers stopped on his pen. One of the directors looked from Charles to Ava and then quickly down at the agenda, sensing history without knowing its shape. Margaret watched the moment unfold with the grave stillness of someone who had suspected impact and now saw the full force of it land. Ava set her coat over the back of the empty chair and placed the portfolio on the table with a single clean motion. No trembling hands. No theatrical coolness. Only control. Then she looked directly at Charles and said, "Good morning, Mr. Hargrove." Her voice was low, even, entirely professional. That was what made it hit harder. There was no revenge in it. No visible triumph. No tremor of the girl he had once dismissed. Just a woman arriving in her authority and letting the room understand on its own what had changed. Charles opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. Ava. Her name came out quieter than he intended, not a greeting so much as a fact he had not prepared to survive. Ava inclined her head once, neither warm nor cold. I understand the board has circulated my appointment materials. Margaret stepped in then, not to rescue anyone, but to formalize what the room was already struggling to absorb. Effective immediately, Ava Brooks will serve as interim chief executive officer with full operational authority pending final ratification. Her mandate includes comprehensive review of executive reporting structures, internal controls, and all strategic divisions. The legal language steadied the air a little, but not enough. Charles kept looking at Ava, as if the shape of her standing there might still rearrange into something he could dismiss. It did not. Age had taught him many things, but apparently not enough about the long memory of consequence. This is absurd, he said at last, though his voice lacked its old force. You bring in an outsider without even a proper transition? Ava did not sit. With respect, Mr. Hargrove, decline has already been your transition. Stephen looked down fast enough to avoid being caught reacting. Margaret folded her hands on the table. The board determined immediate action was necessary. Charles barely heard her. His attention had fixed on Ava with the involuntary intensity of someone confronting not just a person, but a verdict delayed by a decade. He searched her face for anger he could answer, bitterness he could call unprofessional, anything familiar enough to fight. What he found instead was discipline. That unsettled him more than fury would have. Fury was easy to label. Discipline meant she had come prepared. You knew, he said, the words aimed at her now, stripped of boardroom polish. You knew whose company this was. Ava met his stare without blinking. Yes. Just that. Yes. Not defensive. Not apologetic. The simplicity of it made several truths visible at once. She had known. She had accepted anyway. She had walked in. Charles felt something tighten behind his ribs, some old structure of certainty taking on water. Stephen cleared his throat softly, attempting to reattach the meeting to procedure. Perhaps we should begin with the stabilization agenda. Ava turned her head toward him. Not quickly. Just enough. We will, she said. After I review direct reporting lines and open internal access. Stephen's expression remained controlled, but one small pulse moved at his jaw. Ava saw it. Charles saw that she saw it. The room did too, though most of them could not yet read what it meant. Ava finally took her seat, opened her portfolio, and arranged 3 documents in front of her with exact alignment. Her hands were steady. Charles remembered, absurdly, a silver tray balanced against her hip years ago, the same precision in her fingers then, the same refusal to shatter in public. He had mistaken that for meekness. Men like him often confused restraint with weakness until restraint returned wearing command. Before we proceed, Ava said, looking around the table, I want to be clear about one thing. I was not brought here to preserve appearances. I was brought here to tell the truth fast enough to save what can still be saved. She let the sentence rest. Not long, just long enough. Outside the glass, a tugboat moved slowly up the river, leaving a hard white wake against the gray. In the room, no one touched their coffee. Charles looked at the woman in the seat the board had given her and understood something with a clarity that felt almost physical. 10 years earlier, he had sent her out into the cold, assuming the night would close over what he had done. But some nights did not close. Some simply waited. And now, under recessed lights and in front of the city his name once impressed, Ava Brooks had walked back in carrying not the wound he gave her, but the power he never imagined she would hold. Charles Hargrove had recovered enough by the second hour to put his arrogance back on like a tailored coat. It did not fit as naturally as it once had, but he wore it anyway. That was one of the privileges age and wealth gave men like him. They could mistake habit for authority and hope the room would assist. The boardroom had thinned after the formal appointment briefing. Outside counsel left first. 2 independent directors moved to other meetings with folders tucked under their arms and faces carefully blank. Margaret remained for the first operational review, then excused herself with the sort of deliberate timing that meant she wanted to see what happened when old power and new power were forced to sit without a witness. By 11:15, only 4 people remained at the main table, Ava, Charles, Stephen, and the corporate secretary taking notes so quietly she might as well have been part of the furniture. The city outside had brightened slightly, but the sky was still winter white, and the river looked like dull metal under the light. Ava stood near the screen, one hand resting lightly on the remote, the other on a stack of briefing binders that had not yet been opened by half the people who claimed to understand them. She had spent the last 20 minutes asking direct, narrow questions with the precision of a surgeon separating healthy tissue from rot. Which contracts had been renewed without vendor review? Which capital expenditures were delayed in public guidance, but accelerated internally? Why internal audit had missed inconsistencies in procurement allocation 3 quarters running? Stephen answered with polished language and careful pacing. But the more he spoke, the more it became clear that precision made him uncomfortable when it was not his. Charles listened with his chin lifted and one ankle resting on the opposite knee, the very image of a founder inconvenienced by process. But Ava had learned years ago that posture often meant very little when numbers had already begun to betray a man. Let us move to executive sign-off authority, she said. Specifically the last 5 years. Stephen adjusted his tie knot, though it did not need adjusting. Those records are in the data room. I know where they are, Ava said. I am asking why there are 3 separate approval trails on the same set of procurement documents. Stephen gave a small smile, meant to imply overinterpretation. Because large organizations are not as neat as consultants like to imagine. Charles finally spoke then, his voice carrying the dry impatience of someone eager to puncture her momentum. You are not here to interrogate every clerical inconsistency that crosses your desk. Ava turned her head toward him slowly. The movement itself felt controlled enough to become an answer. No, she said. I am here to identify which inconsistencies are clerical and which ones are expensive. Charles leaned back farther in his chair. Hargrove Global was not built by treating every deviation like a scandal. That is fortunate, Ava said evenly, because the deviations are already treating themselves like one. The corporate secretary's pen paused for half a second before resuming. Stephen looked down at his notes as if searching for a safer bridge between the two of them. Charles let out a short breath through his nose. There it is. Ava waited. He gestured toward her with 2 fingers, dismissive and elegant in a way that probably impressed people who had never been the target of it. This is not really about the company for you, is it? It is about making an entrance. Making a point. For the first time that morning, silence sharpened. The kind that exposed motive as clearly as a bright light exposed dust on dark wood. Ava did not answer immediately. She closed the binder in front of her and set the remote down on the table with a soft click. A point, she repeated. Interesting. Charles held her gaze, encouraged by the fact that he had finally moved the exchange onto emotional ground, where he assumed her history would make her vulnerable. You walked in here knowing exactly what this would look like. Yes, Ava said. I did. He sat forward slightly. So let us not pretend this is pure governance. The board may enjoy symbolic gestures. I do not. Stephen kept his eyes on the table, but Ava could see the alertness in the set of his shoulders. He was listening the way opportunists listened when pride started doing their work for them. Ava rested her fingertips on the binder cover and felt, for one brief second, the old service hallway return to her in sensation rather than image. Tile floor. Fluorescent hum. Napkin-wrapped cookies warm from Mrs. Doyle's hand. Noah's small voice saying, you did not take it. Then the feeling passed, and she was here again, in wool and glass and executive light, with a man trying to recast history as inconvenience because guilt had aged badly inside him. You are mistaken, she said. This is not symbolic for me. Charles lifted an eyebrow. No. Her voice remained low, but the temperature in it changed. Symbolic would have been me standing in this room to enjoy your discomfort. That is not why I am here. He looked at her, searching for the tremor of anger he could call unprofessional. She gave him none. Then why are you here? He asked. Ava met his stare without wavering. Because your company is sick. Because the board waited too long. Because the people on the floors below this one, the ones with mortgages and student loans and aging parents and no golden parachutes, will pay first if the truth keeps being delayed to protect the pride of men at the top. Stephen's jaw tightened at that. Charles's expression hardened, but there was something else behind it now too, something thinner and less controlled. Not merely irritation. Exposure. You speak as if you know this place, he said. Ava let the sentence settle before answering. I know enough. Charles laughed once, without humor. You knew enough to let the board hand you the chair and let me discover who you were in front of my own directors. Ava's eyes did not leave his. You had 10 years to discover who I was. The line landed so cleanly the room seemed to recoil from it. Even Stephen looked up then, fast, as if he had forgotten himself. The corporate secretary stopped typing entirely. Charles's face changed in increments. First disbelief, then offense, then something quieter and far more dangerous to his self-image, the recognition that he had earned the sentence. He glanced toward the windows, then back at Ava, but whatever he had planned to say next had lost some internal support. Pride did that under pressure. It sounded strongest before it began to crack. You think this gives you moral leverage, he said at last. I think, Ava replied, that facts do. She opened the binder again and slid one page free. For example, this. She placed the page on the table and turned it so both men could see. An internal procurement summary. 3 overlapping signatures. 1 vendor code repeated under different categories. A discrepancy small enough to hide inside complexity, large enough to matter if traced. Stephen's pupils changed first. Only slightly. But Ava had spent years reading the instant before denial formed. I requested this file 20 minutes ago, she said. It arrived with 2 pages missing. Then it arrived again, complete, after I asked a second time through audit. Charles looked from the paper to Stephen. What is this? Stephen answered too quickly. A clerical mismatch. We can have finance reconcile it by close of business. Ava folded her hands loosely. No. Finance will not be reconciling its own trail. Audit will. Under my office. Stephen's voice cooled. That is a dramatic overcorrection. No, Ava said. It is called independence. Charles stared at the paper as though it might still rearrange into something smaller. Outside, the winter light brightened and turned one edge of the table silver. In the corridor beyond the frosted glass, an assistant passed with 2 coffees balanced in a cardboard tray, then vanished into blur again. Ordinary movement. Ordinary office sounds. But inside the room, the air had shifted permanently. Charles looked back at Ava and saw what he should have understood the moment she entered. She had not returned carrying grievance like a weapon. She had returned carrying discipline like a blade too sharp to need display. You have made your point, he said, though the words sounded weaker than he intended. Ava gave the faintest shake of her head. No, Mr. Hargrove. She tapped the page once, not hard, just enough. I have started my job. At 2:13 that afternoon, Ava was alone in the temporary chief executive office the board had assigned her, a corner suite still carrying the afterimage of the man who had occupied it before caution became more expensive than ego. The room smelled faintly of cedar polish, stale coffee, and the ghost of somebody else's cologne buried in the leather chairs. Through the windows, January light lay pale over the city, turning the river into a flat strip of pewter. On the credenza behind her sat a bowl of white orchids someone in corporate hospitality had delivered that morning, their petals too perfect to be trusted. Ava had already moved them 6 inches to the left, so they stopped blocking the stack of audit binders. That was how she worked when something mattered. She cleared sightlines first. Her chief of staff, Elena Ruiz, had been with her less than 6 hours and already understood not to interrupt unless the interruption improved the truth. So when Elena knocked once and stepped in holding a slim black archive box, Ava looked up immediately. This came from basement records, Elena said. Unrequested. No return note. It was logged through facilities, not finance. Ava frowned slightly. Who sent it up? Nobody wants to say. Elena placed the box on the desk with both hands, as if the weight of it had more to do with contents than cardboard. A white inventory label had yellowed at the corners. Procurement and household event expense records. Winter archive. Year 10 prior. For a second the room seemed to tilt, not in motion, but in time. 10 years prior. Winter. Ava felt a small hard pulse in her throat and hated that her body recognized the decade before her mind agreed to it. Thank you, she said. Elena hesitated. You want me to stay? Ava considered that, then shook her head. No, but keep audit close. And have legal on standby in case this turns into more than sloppy bookkeeping. Elena nodded once and left, shutting the door softly behind her. The office went still again. Ava rested her fingertips on the lid of the box and waited one breath longer than she needed to. Then she opened it. Inside were old expense ledgers, event invoices, vendor receipts, catering tallies, handwritten routing slips, and 3 holiday planning folders bound with fraying green tabs. The paper smelled dry and faintly dusty, the way old records always did, as if time itself had a scent once it sat undisturbed long enough. Ava drew the first folder out and laid it open. Hargrove Family Residence. Christmas Eve event. Floral, catering, transport, seasonal staff, private gift handling. Her eyes moved faster as the old muscle memory kicked in. Inventory. Sequence. Anomaly. She traced line items with one finger, not because she needed to, but because contact helped structure thought. At first, everything looked ordinary in the expensive, excessive way wealthy households made ordinary look. Imported arrangements. Specialty desserts. Temporary waitstaff. Security overtime. Then she found the gift register. A typed list of items assigned to internal staging before presentation. Jewelry. Watches. Limited edition pieces. 1 diamond earring set entered under personal family distribution. Logged to coat room, transfer before 7 p.m. Then a handwritten correction in blue ink, squeezed too tightly into the margin. Relocated pending revised budget coding. No initials. No explanation. Ava felt the room narrow. She kept turning pages. A routing memo appeared beneath the register, nearly hidden between catering receipts. Transfer authorization requested by S. Hale. Interim finance review required. Ava stared at the line until the letters stopped being letters and became a pulse from the past. Stephen Hale. Not yet chief financial officer then. Just a finance man moving quickly through rooms where he did not belong by acting as if he did. The memory returned so sharply it brought sound with it this time. Polished shoes in the entry hall, the low swirl of party music, the velvet box on a table where it should never have been left unattended, Stephen brushing past her too fast with the clipped urgency of someone already editing the scene in his favor. Ava reached deeper into the box and pulled out the second folder. This one contained facilities notes, temporary service staffing, and house manager sign-offs. Halfway through she found a sealed incident envelope already opened once and reclosed with brittle tape. Her name was on the front in block print. Brooks, Ava. Internal note. No action required. The words hit with a force so clean it was almost quiet. She slid the folded sheet from inside. It was a summary memo, and signed, likely drafted for internal use, and then buried when burying became more convenient than honesty. Temporary staff member observed in vicinity of coat room at approximately 6:42 p.m. Additional presence of finance associate Stephen Hale logged through service corridor at approximately 6:39 p.m. Item discrepancy reported 7:10 p.m. No direct evidence connecting staff member Brooks to missing property. Recommendation: review internal handling process. Ava read that one sentence 3 times. No direct evidence connecting staff member Brooks to missing property. The sentence she had been denied was right there, 10 years old and folded into a box in basement storage while her life had been knocked sideways upstairs under Christmas lights. She sat back slowly, one hand still on the paper. Outside, somewhere below the windows, a siren passed and dissolved into traffic. Inside, the office stayed very quiet. The orchids on the credenza looked obscene now. All that cultivated innocence beside a buried record of cowardice. Ava lowered her eyes again and kept going. There was more. A vendor adjustment form rerouting holiday gift insurance under discretionary event expenses. Another notation by S. Hale. A budget variance concealed across 2 codes. Small enough not to alert anyone glancing once. Large enough to matter if anyone had cared to look twice. Ava cared. She lined the pages side by side on the desk until the pattern emerged whole. Stephen had moved the jewelry line item. Stephen had been in the corridor moments before the accusation. Internal staff had noted the lack of evidence against her. Somewhere between that note and the ballroom, the truth had been smothered because it was easier to sacrifice a young black maid than question a rising white finance man in a wealthy house full of guests. Ava let the thought land exactly as it was, without softening it for the sake of professionalism inside her own mind. Professionalism had its uses. Self-deception was not one of them. A soft knock touched the door again. This time Elena entered without waiting, her face alert. Margaret Ellis is on line 1, she said. Ava looked at the spread of papers, the old blue ink, her own name on the memo that should have changed everything and changed nothing. Tell her I will call back in 5 minutes. Elena started to leave, then paused when she saw Ava's expression. You found something. It was not a question. Ava nodded once. I found the first lie. Elena's eyes shifted to the desk, taking in the age of the documents and the care with which Ava had arranged them. Do you want legal? Not yet, Ava said. First I want witnesses. To what? Ava lifted the unsigned memo between 2 fingers. The paper crackled softly. To the fact that the truth existed at the time and was ignored. Elena drew a slow breath, understanding arriving in pieces. This is personal. Ava looked at her then, really looked. No, she said, though her voice had grown quieter. This was personal 10 years ago. Today it is evidence. Elena gave a small, respectful nod and left. Ava turned back to the desk and reached for her phone. Her hand was steady now, more steady than she expected. Shock had passed. In its place was something older and cleaner. Not vengeance. Not even satisfaction. Clarification. She called Margaret first and asked her to come upstairs immediately, not as board chair, but as witness. Then she asked Elena to locate the current head of internal audit and, if possible, Mrs. Doyle, now retired and living in New Jersey according to the personnel file. Finally, after a brief hesitation she did not show on her face, she asked for Noah Hargrove. She was told he was in the building, working from the creative office 3 floors down. Good, she thought. Let the people who still had the capacity to see come into the room before the ones who had spent years profiting from blindness. She ended the calls and stood by the window for exactly 10 seconds, looking down at the winter city moving as if truth never altered the weather. Then she returned to the desk, squared the papers, and waited beside the evidence of a lie that had taken 10 years to walk upstairs. Margaret Ellis arrived first, still carrying the winter air on her coat and a look on. Her face that had already made peace with the possibility that the day was going to get worse before it got honest. Noah came less than 2 minutes later, a dark sweater under his overcoat, his hair still wind-touched from stepping outside for coffee or air or whatever men reached for when old family buildings began to feel too small. Mrs. Doyle was last, slower now, silver at the temples, wrapped in a camel coat and sensible boots dusted with salt from the sidewalk. Time had gentled her posture, but not her eyes. She stepped into the office, saw Ava standing behind the desk, and pressed one hand lightly to her chest, as if memory had crossed the room before words did. Oh, she said softly. Ava. It was not shock exactly. It was recognition carrying guilt, affection, and the ache of a woman who had once known better and not done enough. Ava came around the desk. Thank you for coming. Mrs. Doyle looked at her for another second, then gave a small nod. When the call said your name, I thought perhaps I had heard wrong. You did not. Margaret closed the office door herself. Noah remained near the window at first, taking in the arrangement on the desk, the old folders, the archive box, the memo laid flat beneath a paperweight, Ava's neat rows of evidence where someone else might have left emotional wreckage. He looked at Ava, and something in his expression shifted toward a sadness so old it felt almost inherited. You found the record, he said. Ava studied him. You knew there might be one. Noah exhaled through his nose and glanced down. I hoped. That is not the same thing. Margaret removed her gloves and set them beside the orchids with quiet disdain, as though even flowers should not be allowed to decorate a room where truth had been delayed this long. Show us, she said. Ava did. She walked them through the documents one by one, not dramatically, not as performance, but with the same disciplined clarity she had used in the boardroom. The gift register, the blue ink notation, the transfer authorization connected to Stephen Hale, the corridor log, the unsigned internal memo stating there was no direct evidence against her. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The papers did all the speaking men like Stephen had spent a decade trying to avoid. Mrs. Doyle took off her glasses, wiped them, and put them back on, though it was clear she was not cleaning lenses so much as buying a second to steady herself. I remember that corridor, she said. I remember seeing Mr. Hale moving too quickly for a man who claimed he was only checking invoices. Noah turned toward her. You never told my father that. Pain moved across her face like a shadow over water. I tried to tell your mother. She told me the guests were still in the house, and the family would discuss it later. Later never came. Margaret's mouth hardened. Because later is where privileged people store inconvenient truth. No one argued with that. Ava slid the unsigned memo toward Mrs. Doyle. Did you write this? Mrs. Doyle looked down at it for a long moment. No, she said. But I know who did. Daniel Mercer. Assistant operations manager. Quiet man. Kept copies of everything because he did not trust anyone above him. Margaret lifted her chin. Is he still alive? Florida, Mrs. Doyle said. Retired 3 years ago. If you can find him, he will remember. Noah was still staring at the memo. No direct evidence, he repeated, almost to himself. She said that, he added after a moment, looking at Ava now. That night, she told him she did not take it, and I believed her. Ava held his gaze. I know. The words made him blink as if they carried more mercy than he deserved. I should have done more. Ava did not rescue him from that sentence. Some truths needed to stand without cushions. Yes, she said gently. Noah accepted it with a small nod, his throat moving once. He looked older in that moment than he had an hour earlier. Not weaker, just more honest. Margaret turned back to the desk. Where is Stephen now? Still in the building, Ava said. He believes audit is reviewing procurement discrepancies. He does not yet know I have these. Margaret's expression became almost cold enough to match the windows. Good. Mrs. Doyle looked from Ava to the others, then to the papers again. And Charles. The room went quiet for half a beat. Ava answered without hesitation. He needs to hear this in the room. Noah pushed away from the window then, finally stepping closer to the desk. Closer to the past he had spent years carrying in fragments. He will try to make it about procedure, he said. Or loyalty. Or timing. Ava nodded. He can try. Margaret gave the slightest approving look. He does not get to decide the frame anymore. Elena knocked once and entered with her tablet in hand. Stephen Hale is on his way up. Mr. Hargrove as well. They were told this is an urgent governance issue. She glanced at the people gathered in the room and understood instantly that the temperature had changed. Do you want legal present? Ava thought for 1 second. Not yet. I want the truth to arrive before the attorneys do. Elena stepped back out. Mrs. Doyle clasped her hands together tightly, the old housekeeper instinct still there, as if bracing for broken crystal no one could see yet. Noah looked at Ava with a quiet kind of wonder that did not ask for forgiveness, only acknowledged what she had become in spite of them. You could have buried him with this, he said softly. Ava looked at the memo again, then at the window, then back at him. No, she said. I could have humiliated him. Her voice stayed calm. That would not be the same as justice. Margaret's eyes narrowed, not in disagreement, but in recognition. She was seeing the difference too. Ava was not preparing a spectacle. She was preparing an accounting. There was a knock at the outer door, firmer this time, followed by the sound of voices in the reception area. One clipped and defensive. One lower, slower, already irritated by being summoned. Stephen arrived first, entering with the tight smile of a man who had been inconvenienced and intended to charge interest. Charles came right behind him, his overcoat still on, gloves in one hand, his impatience visible before he spoke. He stopped when he saw the room. Margaret by the desk. Noah near the window. Mrs. Doyle standing beside the chair. Ava at the center, one hand resting on the old folder. His eyes moved across the arrangement and sharpened. What is this? Ava did not invite either man to sit. An overdue meeting. Stephen's gaze landed on the archive box, then the papers. The blood left his face so subtly that only someone watching for it would have seen. Ava saw it immediately. Charles saw only enough to grow. Annoyed. I have another call in 20 minutes, he said. Then I suggest you use the next 19 wisely, Ava replied. She lifted the unsigned memo from the desk and placed it in the center where everyone could see. Old paper. Black type. Her name. The room did not move. Stephen stared at it without blinking. Charles frowned, stepped forward, and reached for the page. As he read, the change in him was slower than Stephen's, but more terrible. Because what drained from Charles was not merely confidence. It was certainty. When he reached the line that said no direct evidence connected Ava Brooks to the missing property, his hand stopped. The office became so quiet that the low hum of the heat vent sounded almost loud. Noah watched his father. Mrs. Doyle watched the floor. Margaret watched everything. And Ava, standing in the clean winter light of the office he no longer controlled, watched the truth finally enter the room with no place left to hide. Charles read the memo once, then again, as if repetition might somehow restore the version of the past he had been living inside. It did not. His hand remained on the paper, but his grip changed. Not firm anymore, just present, as though touch could slow what understanding was doing to him. The office held still around that small movement. Winter light pressed against the glass. The orchids on the credenza looked almost colorless now. Stephen was the first to speak, which surprised no one. Men like him rarely mistook silence for safety. "This proves nothing on its own," he said. Too fast, too smooth, his voice reaching for control before the facts finished settling. "An unsigned internal note is not evidence of wrongdoing. It is hearsay preserved in paper." Margaret turned her head toward him with measured contempt. Interesting choice of language for someone whose initials appear 3 times in adjacent transfer records. Stephen swallowed once. Those notations reflect routine handling adjustments. Ava did not look at him yet. She kept her eyes on Charles. "Read the corridor log attached behind it." Charles's fingers moved stiffly as he lifted the next sheet. The longer he looked, the less room remained in his face for denial. Ava watched the knowledge arrive in him the way a storm crossed glass, first distant, then undeniable. He had not known the full mechanics, not then. That much was suddenly clear. He had not needed to know. That was the uglier truth. All he had needed was a young black maid standing in the wrong part of his house, and a convenient story offered by a white man in a finance suit. The lie had not required investigation. It had required permission. Charles had given it. Noah spoke into the silence, his voice low but steady. "She told you she did not take it." Charles closed his eyes for one brief second. "Noah." "No," Noah said, and there was no anger in him now. Only the strength of a man who had gotten tired of inheritance being mistaken for loyalty. "Do not do that. Do not say my name like it changes what happened. She told you the truth. I told you I believed her." Mrs. Doyle tried to raise concerns. "And you chose the version that cost you least." Mrs. Doyle drew a shaky breath and looked at Charles with the exhausted sorrow of someone who had dusted too many rooms where money made conscience lazy. "Sir," she said softly, "I was there. I should have pushed harder. But you did not want pushing. You wanted resolution before dessert." The sentence landed with a terrible gentleness. Charles lowered the papers. His face had gone pale around the mouth. For the first time since Ava walked back into his life, he looked his age. Not old exactly, just stripped of the insulation pride had given him. "Stephen," he said without looking up, "did you move that item?" Stephen straightened. "Charles, this is becoming theatrical. Did you move it?" The question came harder this time, not louder, but stripped of social varnish. Stephen glanced toward Ava, then Margaret, then back to Charles, calculating distance the way he always had. "I adjusted coding to avoid confusion during the event," he said. "That was all." Ava finally turned to him. "And when the item went missing for that window of time, you allowed suspicion to fall on the person least protected in the house." Stephen's jaw tightened. "I did not accuse you." Ava held his gaze. "No, you positioned me." Margaret folded her arms. "Functionally the same thing." Stephen looked around the room and seemed, for the first time, to understand that there was nowhere left to distribute blame without it returning heavier. "It was 10 years ago," he said. "There was pressure, guests, confusion, incomplete information." Ava's expression did not change. "And yet somehow the incomplete information always landed on me with complete certainty. That ended whatever defense still imagined itself possible." The room went quiet again. Charles stood very still, the old memo in his hand, and the present closing around him. When he finally looked at Ava, there was something in his eyes that had not been there all day. Not authority, not strategy. Recognition, yes, but bruised now by shame. Real shame. The kind that arrived late and did not ask to be admired for showing up. "I was wrong," he said. The words came rough and used. Stephen let out a short breath as if to interrupt, but Margaret lifted one hand and stopped him without looking. Ava said nothing. Charles swallowed and tried again, this time to her directly. "I was wrong about you." Noah's face tightened almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Doyle looked down. Ava remained still, because accuracy mattered now more than comfort. "You were wrong about more than me," she said. Charles absorbed that. His shoulders lowered by a fraction. "Yes," he said. "Yes." He set the memo back on the desk with greater care than he had picked it up. I saw what was easiest to see. I believed what fit the room I was standing in. And I let that become action. The confession did not clean anything. Ava knew that. So did everyone else. Some harm stayed in the world even after language found it. But truth altered the air. It made pretending more difficult. Stephen moved then, not toward remorse, but survival. Before anybody overreacts, we need counsel present. We need to control exposure, review archival integrity, understand legal implications. Ava looked at him with a calm that made his urgency seem cheap. You were suspended effective immediately pending full audit review. He stared at her. You cannot do that unilaterally. I already did. Margaret stepped beside Ava, a quiet transfer of institutional weight. The board will support it. Stephen's face hardened into something brittle and colorless. He looked to Charles for rescue out of old habit. Charles did not give it. He stood with his eyes on the desk, on the evidence, on the sentence that should have changed a girl's life and had instead been boxed and buried. Stephen, Charles said, still not raising his head, leave. It was not thunderous. It was worse. It was final. Stephen looked as though he wanted one last elegant sentence, one last maneuver, but some instinct finally told him the room was closed. He took his coat from the chair by the door and walked out without another word. When the door shut, the silence that followed felt cleaner. Not warm, not easy, just cleaner. Ava gathered the papers into one neat stack. Her movements were measured, almost gentle. Charles watched her do it and seemed to understand that dignity was not something wealth could stage. Sometimes it belonged most fully to the person a room had once tried hardest to diminish. I cannot undo it, he said. Ava met his eyes. No, he nodded once, accepting the boundary. Outside, a weak strip of late afternoon sun broke through the clouds and laid a pale band of gold across the floorboards near the window. It reached Mrs. Doyle's boots first, then Noah's sleeve, then the edge of Ava's desk. But I can say it in front of the people who matter, Charles said. I can say I failed you. I can say you told the truth, and I chose convenience over decency. I can put that in the record. Ava studied him for a long moment. The younger version of herself, the one standing under Christmas lights in a borrowed uniform with cold in her hands and humiliation rising in her throat, might once have believed an apology from a man like Charles Hargrove would fix something fundamental. The woman she was now knew better. Still, record mattered. Witness mattered. Truth spoken aloud mattered. Yes, she said. You can. Noah looked at her then with something close to gratitude, though it was not gratitude for mercy. It was gratitude for proportion. She was not sparing his father. She was choosing justice over spectacle. Margaret, who had seen enough boardroom wars to know the difference, gave the smallest nod. Mrs. Doyle wiped at one eye and then seemed annoyed with herself for doing it. Charles drew in a slow breath, as if learning the mechanics of humility required actual labor. Ava, he said, and this time her name sounded different in his mouth. Not like a fact ambushing him, like a person he had finally met too late. I am sorry. She heard him. She believed he meant it. And still, the most important thing in the room was not his apology. It was the order of the moment itself. The maid he had sent out into the cold now stood in the light, holding the truth, deciding what happened next. Ava placed the evidence folder into a new legal binder Elena had set on the desk and closed the rings with a quiet metallic click. We will document everything, she said. We will notify the board. We will correct the internal record. And then we will get back to the work of saving this company from the habits that made this possible. No one argued. Beyond the windows, the city kept moving through the winter afternoon, cabs threading the avenues, steam lifting from rooftop vents, the river carrying light in broken silver lines. Inside the office, the heat hummed softly through the vent, and for the first time all day the room felt less like a stage for power and more like a place where human beings had been made to face themselves. Ava stood at the head of the desk, one hand resting lightly on the binder, while Charles moved aside without being told to, giving space he could not command anymore. The sun slipped farther across the floor, touching the polished wood, the edge of the chair, the toe of Ava's shoe. She did not smile. She did not need to. 10 years earlier, he had mistaken her silence for smallness. Now he finally understood what it had really been. Strength waiting for its hour. By 6:30 that evening, the building had changed its voice. Daytime confidence had drained out of the hallways and left behind the quieter sounds of truth doing administrative work. Elevators opened and closed with soft chimes. Copy machines hummed from distant departments, still trying to pretend this was an ordinary Monday. Somewhere below, a vacuum moved across carpet in patient back and forth lines. The winter sky beyond the glass had deepened from white to blue-gray, and the first office lights across Midtown had begun to blink on one floor at a time, as if the city itself were taking attendance. Ava stood at the far end of the executive conference room, sleeves still buttoned, posture still exact, a legal binder open in front of her beside 2 fresh witness statements and a draft board notification that Elena was refining in real time. The room smelled faintly of toner, coffee gone cold, and the lemon polish facilities used on the walnut table after market close. It was the kind of smell that belonged to institutions trying to reassure themselves they were clean. Margaret sat 3 seats down reviewing the language of the formal suspension notice. Noah was near the windows with his jacket off now, tie loosened, reading the corrected chronology Ava had assembled from the archive file, facilities logs, and procurement records. Mrs. Doyle had gone home an hour earlier, but not before signing a statement with steady hands and watery eyes, then touching Ava's wrist once on her way out. The gesture so brief and human it stayed in the room after she left. Charles had not gone home. That surprised Ava less than it might have earlier in the day. Some men ran from shame. Others, when it finally reached them, stood inside it, because leaving would feel too much like proving the accusation that had already become true. He was in the adjacent board anteroom now with outside counsel, dictating a correction to the internal historical file and a personal statement to the board acknowledging his role in the wrongful accusation and the failure of supervisory judgment. The first draft had sounded defensive. Margaret sent it back. The second had sounded polished. Ava sent it back. By the third, the language had become plain enough to matter. At 6:42, Elena entered carrying a marked-up packet and a fresh cup of black coffee she placed near Ava's hand without interrupting the sentence she was reviewing. Audit wants authorization to lock 2 legacy finance drives before morning, Elena said. Do it, Ava replied, signing the margin note. And copy external forensic review. I do not want chain of custody question later. Elena nodded. Also, Daniel Mercer returned the call. He remembers the memo. He says he filed it after Mrs. Doyle raised concerns and was told to preserve it quietly because no one wanted conflict with the family on Christmas Eve. Noah shut his eyes for 1 second by the window, then opened them again. Margaret took off her glasses. There it is, she said. Convenience in its final form. Ava looked down at the coffee but did not drink it yet. Get his statement tonight if he is willing. He is, Elena said. He sounded relieved, somebody finally asked. Relieved. The words settled heavily. How many people had spent 10 years carrying splinters of the truth because the full shape of it never had a room to stand in? Ava signed the drive lock authorization and moved to the next page. Not because she was cold. Because she had learned long ago that dignity often looked like continuing to do the work after emotion had made its point. The conference room door opened again. Charles stepped in alone this time. Overcoat removed, tie slightly loosened, age sitting on him more honestly than it had that morning. He carried a single page in his hand. He did not come all the way to the table at first. He stopped just inside, as if instinct still remembered thresholds and the cost of crossing them without permission. Margaret looked up. Is it done? Charles nodded. The statement is filed with the board secretary. Legal has the correction notice. Internal records will be amended before tomorrow. His voice had lost its old lacquer. It sounded plain now, and therefore more credible. Ava set down her pen and waited. He stepped closer and laid the page beside her binder. It was not for the board. It was handwritten. This is separate, he said. It does not need to go anywhere public unless you want it to. Ava glanced at the paper but did not pick it up. What is it? Charles looked at her, then at the windows where the city lights had fully come alive. The account of that night, he said. Without the edits I made in my own head for 10 years. The room stayed quiet. Noah turned from the window but did not speak. Margaret watched Charles with the expression of a woman who still did not trust him but was willing to let sincerity prove itself through restraint. Ava placed her palm lightly on the handwritten page. The paper was warm from his hand. Why now, she asked. Charles gave a tired, almost disbelieving breath. Because all day I have been trying to understand how I became the kind of man who could watch decency ask for a chance and answer it with status instead. He looked down briefly. And because if I leave the truth only in the language lawyers can survive, then I am still hiding. Ava studied him, searching not for emotion, but for evasion. She found less than before. Maybe none. Sit, she said. It was not kindness exactly. It was permission to be accountable without spectacle. Charles sat, not at the head of the table, halfway down. The geography of that mattered to everyone in the room. He folded his hands once, unfolded them, then began to speak without reading from the page. He said he remembered the music, the guests, the pressure of maintaining an image even in his own house. He said Stephen had come to him with urgency and confidence, and that confidence had looked like credibility because he had been trained by class and habit to read it that way. He said Ava had looked him in the eyes and denied taking anything, and he had still trusted the narrative that preserved comfort over the person standing in front of him. He said the ugliest part was not that he had been misled. It was that he had been ready to be misled because the accusation fit too neatly inside his assumptions. He did not use the word race first. Noah did. Quietly. Directly. Say all of it, he told his father. Charles swallowed. Then he did. He said he had made a decision shaped by race, by hierarchy, by the terrible ease with which wealthy white men could call a black woman suspicious simply because the room made that option available. No one moved while he said it. Not because the sentence healed anything, but because naming a thing correctly changed the air around it. When he finished, the room remained still for several seconds. Ava looked at the binder, the witness statements, the marked pages, the city light reflecting in the black shine of the table. Then she reached for the handwritten page and read the first 2 lines. They were clumsy, human, unpolished. Better that way. She said it atop the legal binder. This stays in the file, she said. Charles nodded once. It should. Noah let out a slow breath that sounded like grief, finally deciding to become something useful. Margaret closed the suspension notice and aligned it with the edge of the table. Elena, standing near the door with her tablet dimmed against her chest, looked around the room as if she understood she was witnessing not redemption exactly, but the harder beginning of it. Ava rose and moved to the windows. The glass was cool beside her shoulder. Far below, headlights streamed up the avenues in white and red ribbons. A helicopter crossed the darkening sky, its small blinking light moving steadily east. Reflected in the glass, she could see the room behind her in layers. Margaret seated and composed, Noah standing straighter than he had all day, Charles smaller somehow, but more real, the open binder waiting, the orchids now only shapes in the corner, no longer the room's false center. She thought of a service hallway 10 years ago, of cheap winter gloves and a borrowed coat, of walking into the cold with humiliation burning hot enough to feel like fever. She thought of how long it had taken to build a life large enough that she could return not as a wound, but as a force with choices. Then she turned back to the table. We are done for tonight, she said. Tomorrow we begin the real repair. No one mistook the sentence for optimism. Repair was not a speech. It was repetition. Records corrected. Systems cleaned. People forced to see what convenience had cost. Margaret gathered her papers. Noah reached for his coat. Charles stood, slower than before, and for a moment seemed as though he might say something else to Ava. He did not. Some night's language had already done all it could without beginning to ask for absolution. He gave a small nod instead, and left with the quiet steps of a man learning the size of the room after power had stopped widening it for him. One by one the others followed. Elena last, after dimming the screen and collecting the empty coffee cups. Then the conference room was nearly silent. Ava remained by the table alone for one final moment, hand resting on the closed binder. Above her, the recessed lights hummed softly. Beyond the glass, the city kept shining against the cold. She drew one slow breath in, then let it go. 10 years earlier, they had sent her out into Christmas Eve believing she would disappear into it. Instead, she had come back, carrying the one thing the building had almost forgotten how to recognize. Not revenge. Not noise. Something rarer. A kind of strength that could look straight at humiliation, survive it, and still choose to make room for truth before pride. In the dark window, her reflection stood clear and steady, and the light from the city gathered around her like it had been waiting there all along. The next morning, the building woke differently. Not cleaner, not kinder, not redeemed in some easy overnight way, but quieter in the places that used to depend on performance. The lobby still shone with marble and brass. The elevators still carried men in tailored coats and women balancing coffee, phones, and ambition before 8:30. Security still nodded people through the turnstiles under the soft electronic chirp of badges meeting glass. But word had already traveled in the peculiar, disciplined current that moved through large companies when something true had happened on an upper floor. No one said much out loud. They never did. Yet reception spoke more softly. Assistants looked up faster when Ava crossed the hall. Two junior analysts in the corridor straightened as she passed, not from fear, but from the instinct people had around someone who had changed the moral temperature of a place without once raising her voice. The sky over Manhattan had turned clear overnight. Sunlight came cold and bright through the eastern windows, striking the edges of conference tables, the chrome of elevator doors, the glass carafes in meeting rooms where strategy would now have to survive contact with honesty. Ava stepped out of the executive elevator at 7:52 with a black coat over one arm and a paper cup of coffee she had bought herself from the cart outside, because some rituals belonged to ordinary life, and she intended to keep them. Elena was already waiting with the morning packet. "Board statement is finalized," she said as they walked. "Audit locked the finance drives at 1:12 a.m. Daniel Mercer signed remotely. Mrs. Doyle's statement is attached. Internal communications wants guidance on messaging to senior staff." Ava took the packet without slowing. "No inspirational language," she said. "No culture platitudes. Facts only." Elena gave a brief smile. "That is what I told them." They entered the executive conference room together. The binder from the night before sat where Ava had left it, square to the edge of the table, a small pool of sun warming the leather cover. Beside it lay Charles's handwritten account, now scanned, logged, and indexed as part of the formal record. Seeing it there did not satisfy Ava. Satisfaction was too thin for what the moment required. But it steadied something. The truth was no longer trapped in memory, or buried in cardboard, or dependent on whether powerful people felt like being decent that day. It had weight now. Sequence. Witness. Place. By 8:15, Margaret joined them. At 8:23, Noah arrived carrying a slim folder and an expression Ava recognized immediately. The face of someone who had gone home, slept badly, and woken up unwilling to continue inheriting silence. "I have something for the employee town hall," he said. Ava looked up from her notes. "There is no town hall yet." "There should be," Noah replied. "Not today. Not theatrical. But soon. People know enough to be unsettled. They should hear what accountability sounds like before rumor turns it into mythology." Margaret, removing her gloves one finger at a time, glanced between them. "He is right." Ava considered that, then nodded once. "Later this week. After the initial governance actions." Noah handed her the folder. Inside was a draft proposal for a staff listening series, anonymous reporting reform, and scholarship funding for service workers' families through the Hargrove Foundation, funded not by public relations budget, but by executive compensation reductions. Ava read the last page twice. "This was your idea?" Noah held her gaze. "It should have been 10 years ago." The sentence rested there quietly, without performance. Ava closed the folder. "Then we do it properly now." At 9 o'clock, Charles entered. No escort. No ceremony. Just a dark suit, a plain tie, and the visible effort of a man choosing not to hide behind the architecture that had sheltered him all his life. He had asked, through Margaret, for 5 minutes before the board convened. Ava had granted 3. He stopped at the table, not taking a seat until she nodded. Small things mattered when history had been built from larger ones ignored. "I reviewed the final record," he said. "It is accurate." "Good," Ava replied. He looked at the binder, then at her. Morning light exposed every line fatigue had drawn around his eyes. "I also resigned as acting chair of the foundation pending review." Margaret's brows lifted slightly, not in praise, but in acknowledgement that reality was finally reaching his decisions before reputation did. "That was appropriate," she said. Charles inclined his head once. Then he turned to Ava. "I know there is no version of this where I get to ask for anything." She waited. "But I would like permission to say one thing before the board comes in." The room remained still. Ava thought of the service entrance 10 years earlier, of snow beginning to gather in dirty ridges at the curb, of her hands going numb inside cheap gloves while Christmas music leaked faintly from the house she had just been sent out of. Then she thought of this room, this table, this sun on leather, this exact morning built from years she had carried without witnesses. One thing, she said. Charles drew in a breath. Thank you for telling the truth without turning it into cruelty. Noah looked down at the table. Margaret's face did not soften, but something in it shifted away from guardedness and toward recognition. Ava held Charles's gaze for a long moment. He was not asking for forgiveness. At least not today. He was naming the thing he had only begun to understand. That power looked one way when men like him performed it, and another when someone who had been denied it chose restraint anyway. Cruelty is easy, Ava said. Correction is harder. Charles nodded once, as if the sentence would remain with him longer than any formal censure. Then the first board members began arriving, their voices faint outside the door, papers rustling, chairs moving, the machinery of institution resuming around a truth it could no longer afford to exclude. What followed was not dramatic. That was part of what made it matter. The suspension was ratified. The archival correction was entered. A formal review of legacy practices was approved unanimously. External investigators were retained. The foundation review was opened. The board authorized staff reforms, vendor oversight changes, and a historical conduct review covering executive decisions that had been shielded by household informality and family privilege. No speeches swelled. No violins rose. Pens moved across paper. Hands lifted in votes. A company began, in the driest language possible, to admit that morality had operational consequences. By noon, sunlight had shifted across the room and settled nearer Ava's chair. Through the glass wall, the city looked crisp and almost indifferent, ferries cutting white seams through the river, steam rising from vents, people on sidewalks carrying lunch bags and deadlines and private griefs no quarterly report would ever capture. The meeting ended with the soft scrape of chairs and the low murmur of board members leaving. Changed in that subtle executive way, where transformation first appears as caution. Margaret stayed behind to collect the signed resolutions. Noah lingered near the door. Charles was the last to stand. For a second, as the others moved out, he seemed unsure whether to leave first or wait. Ava spared him the uncertainty. Go ahead, she said. He nodded and stepped around the table, but when he reached the door he paused and looked back. Not at the room. At her. Then he left without speaking. Noah watched the door close. He will be carrying this for the rest of his life. Ava gathered her papers into one neat stack. He should. Noah let out a slow breath, then looked toward the windows where winter noon had turned the glass nearly white. So should I. Ava's hands stilled for one beat. She turned to him. Carrying it is not the same as learning from it. He absorbed that with the seriousness of someone who intended not to waste the distinction. Margaret snapped shut the leather folio in her hands. There is your next generation challenge, Noah. Memory with a spine. He gave the smallest, almost rueful smile. Understood. They left a minute later, Margaret to legal, Noah to communications, the floor once again filling with footsteps and muted conversations and the ordinary work that made institutions look seamless from the outside. Ava stayed behind. She walked to the windows and stood with one hand lightly in the pocket of her jacket, looking down at the avenues shining under cold sun. A sanitation truck turned the corner far below. A woman in a red scarf hurried across the crosswalk, carrying flowers wrapped in brown paper. Somewhere on a nearby rooftop, a flag moved once in the wind and settled. The city did not care about justice in the sentimental way stories sometimes pretended. It did not stop for it. It did not soundtrack it. It simply kept going and asked whether people inside it would choose to be human while they did. Ava rested her fingertips against the cool glass. 10 years had taken many things from her. Ease. Innocence. The habit of expecting fairness from a room full of money. But they had given her something too, something no one in that house had understood when they sent her into the cold. They had given her proof that humiliation did not get to write the final draft of a life unless you surrendered the pen. Behind her, on the conference table, the binder lay closed and orderly, no longer a wound in hiding, no longer a secret in a basement box, but part of the official architecture of the company now. Truth had been filed. Consequence had begun. Repair, imperfect and unglamorous, was underway. Ava looked at her reflection in the noon-bright glass, saw the city layered through it, and thought how strange it was that dignity often returned not with noise, but with light. She stood there for one more quiet breath, then turned back toward the table, toward the work, toward the future she had built with steady hands after others tried to reduce her to a suspicion. He had fired a maid. The world had expected her to disappear. Instead, she came back and taught the building what decency looked like when it finally learned to stand up.